right, I want to welcome you all here this evening. Thank you for coming. We're going to be talking about the real cost of price inflation. I think that's fine. How the CPI understates your budget and what investors can do about it. My name is Steve Cunningham. I'm the Director of Research and Acting President for the American Institute for Economic Research. And John Barry is going to be speaking as well. He's the President of American Investment Services. We are, would you go to the next slide? Yeah. We'll work this out. All right, I wanted to talk a little bit about AIER and AIS in case you're new to us. The American Institute for Economic Research was founded in 1933 by Edward Harwood. He was a West Point graduate who went on to graduate school at Rensselaer Polytechnic, a professor at MIT. It's 1933, Great Depression. Some of us don't remember it. My mother does. She's always telling me about it. But it was not just a bad time, but policymakers had a sense that they were blindsided by the Great Depression. We didn't have the data. We weren't routinely collecting the data that you would need to be warned about what was going on. So it really was quite a surprise. So one of the things that happened was Congress and the President decided that they were going to start data collection and not be blindsided again. And so they charged different agencies like the Labor Department and Commerce Department and so on with collecting the data so they would be able to know what's going on. But obviously, raw data doesn't do the trick. You have to have the information. Somebody's got to derive that from the data. And Harwood realized that the American public needed to have this source of information. They needed someone who would be trustworthy, who would apply scientific methods, who would go to the data, get the direct results, who would not spin doctorate, who would not be driven by political interest, but would simply tell the public, here's the way it works. Here's what this leads to. Here are the relationships. Here's what you need to know about what's going on in the economy. He took this proposal to the president of MIT, and the Institute was born in his faculty office. Over the years, it has grown. After World War II, 1946, we moved out to Great Barrington into a property out there because we needed more space, and we've been there ever since. The mission is the same. We are here to support, help the public. We're trying to provide unbiased information so that citizens can make the right decisions to flourish in any kind of an economic environment. That's what we're about. There's a way to do that. You just have to know how to read the economy and what sense it makes. The AIER is a nonprofit, tax-exempt 501c3 corporation. Our sole purpose is to serve the public. American Investment Services is a wholly owned subsidiary, and while it is for profit, it does share our mission, which makes them a little bit unique. They're not the typical profit-seeking organization, and they really were created to serve our mission, our larger mission, as part of our organization. At one time, there was no separate AIS. They were just part of the main organization. And we provided investment advice through the main publications of the Research Institute. But over time, changes in securities laws and things like that, it was necessary to spin them out as a subsidiary. But the mission is the same. The mission is the same. Okay, go ahead. This is a headline from Associated Press. Food and gas prices push U.S. consumer prices higher. Not an uncommon headline, but notice that there's a focus on food and gas prices. And the second line, it says the food and gas prices push U.S. consumer prices higher, but inflation otherwise mild, which means to me as an economist that other components going into the price index must be going down and offsetting it somehow. But it's ironic that a lot of the focus on consumer prices these days is on consumer prices, less food and energy prices, which are, of course, the most volatile components. And if you're like me, it's what you experience the most when you go to the grocery store or to the gas station. You see these prices rising. And this really motivated a lot of what's going to happen here. The next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about inflation, what it is, and how it's measured. For one thing, people say the word inflation, and they mean price inflation. I mean, prices are going up. They're trending upward in a broad-based fashion. The real origins of the term inflation were about monetary inflation. It was about the money supply expanding. And as a result of the money supply expanding too quickly for the growth of real goods and services, prices start to rise. And that's the inflation we experience. So really the price inflation is the outcome, and the money expansion, the money inflation is the cause. But one of the common ways to measure prices and inflation in this country is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is created by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They create a number of these indexes. The CPI-U, U meaning for urban consumers, your urban households, is the most widely known one. It surveys families over a 2-year period, representing about 87% of the total U.S. population. So it's very broad-based. It's created for a purpose. They're trying to look at broad-based price levels after a bunch of different corrections to try to tell what's happening with policy. Is money creation too great? Is it driving up the levels of prices? It's not really a cost of living index, as we'll see. That really isn't what it's about. It's to look at prices under some very specialized conditions. I want to emphasize that BLS does an excellent job. They have some really good people. They're not stupid. They're not trying to mislead anybody. But they're trying to develop something very different than what the public is told that it represents. You have a tendency to look at the CPI and think that it's about your inflation, what you experience, and that's not what it is. It's designed for a very different purpose, so you have to keep that in mind. BLS collects expenditure data from approximately 28,000 weekly diaries and 60,000 quarterly interviews to determine the importance or weight of different items, 200 item categories of goods and services. They're building a shopping list. And they're using interviews with people like you and diaries which they ask people like you to keep in order to build this massive shopping list. And then once a month, they shop it. It's not that complicated. They literally pay people to go shop the list and see what prices they get. So they use these categories, and they collect this data, and then they're going to build an average price. Next slide, please. They send out shoppers, which they call economic assistants. This sounds like sanitation engineer or something, I think, but they're shoppers. I want this job. I can't figure out where you sign up for this job. I mean, what a great job, right? You get to go out and shop, and you find out what these things cost. They look at about 80,000 items each month and find out what they cost, and they construct this shopping bill for the shopping spree they go on. This reminds me, I've seen in Connecticut in the Hartford Courant, where they'll take a shopping list of groceries and they'll go out to grocery stores in different areas around the state, and they'll shop it, and they'll compare how much it costs to get the same groceries in different stores in different regions, right? It's exactly what they do. They shop a list, they check the price tag, and they look at it even across regions to find out what the differences are. That's really what it is. Now, there's some other corrections they make too, and we'll talk about that. But that's the basic notion. It's very, very broad-based. Okay, next slide, please. Here are some of the problems. First of all, the CPI that you usually see is seasonally adjusted. You know, so for example, we know that oil prices tend to run up in the summer. So they iron that out. Now, the problem with that is that if I go out and buy gasoline in the summer, I pay more. I mean, I don't have a magical computer that fixes that at the pump for me. I pay more. I experience higher prices. So it does not reflect what you and I experience. It's been fixed to avoid that for a reason, because of what they're trying to do. They want to know this month as an indicator of the whole year, are prices going up? Not what did you pay this month, what does it cost you to live this month? Core CPI is often quoted, and the core means they strip out all food and energy products because they're volatile. They go up and down. We wouldn't want to have them confuse things. They take them out. Okay, and again, they have reasons for wanting to do that. They don't want to be trapped looking at items or having the index dominated by items which are driven by supply and demand, short-term supply and demand characteristics, as opposed to money creation. So they have a reason to take it out, but it doesn't serve us in understanding what's going on in our lives. The index also includes a lot of things that the average person simply doesn't buy very often, or that are contractually fixed in price. So they'll look at a rental value of owning a home. So they convert the cost of a house to a rental price is what they do. And they use that to capture things like house prices. Well, if you have a mortgage, you know that it tends to go the same price every year. That's the way you set it up. You have a contract that puts it in place. Even if you rent, it's a fixed contract. You don't buy a new refrigerator every day. You don't buy a new TV every day. I mean, a lot of things you don't buy every day, but they're in this index, and because of the nature of the technology involved, they don't change in price very often. They don't go up as much. So your experience as a person going out and buying things is much different than what you'll see in this index. It's quality adjusted. Again, you have to go back to their purposes. Quality adjustment is like this. I owned a 1969 Mustang. I loved my Mustang. Almost as much as my 1953 Ford, which I hate to admit to because it tells you how old I am. But anyway, my Ford, for one thing, had forget airbags, forget seat belts, forget, CD players, forget air conditioning. I mean, it didn't have any of those things in it, So if I compare the price of my 53 Ford to a Ford today, it's really like apples and oranges. They aren't remotely the same. There are a lot of quality improvements. And so if you're going to look to try to figure out how much the price of something has gone up, you would have to adjust somehow that the product is different. That's the quality adjustment. So that makes sense from what they're trying to do. But you can't buy a car today without seat belts. It's hard to buy a car without an air conditioner. So, I mean, out-of-pocket expense is going to reflect the actual price tag of that automobile today. And the quality adjustment is really hocus pocus to that. You really won't get a sense of what it costs you day to day to live. It's not really a cost of living index. It really was not designed to be a cost of living index. And so it's misleading in that way. Next slide, please. So at AIER, we heard this. People talk to us. We do something that I like to call economics by walking around. I mean, we actually talk to real people and see what they're doing and what they're experiencing. And when people call us and go, I don't know, they're telling us that the CPI is only up by 3%, and it sure feels like a lot more inflation than that. We listen, and we wanted to see, can we validate that experience? Can we capture somehow? Are people mistaken? Or do they really have the right idea, and somehow we're not capturing this with our data? So people have told us that the CPI just doesn't match their everyday experience. There's a thing like a sticker shock, and I know I've experienced it when I go to the gas station and I'm so surprised at how expensive gasoline is. Or I go to the grocery store and I get to the checkout and I realize that I've spent a whole lot more than I thought. That's sticker shock, Why is that inflation appearing so much higher than CPI? Mortgage prices, mortgage payments don't change. As I said, you don't buy a refrigerator every day. We were incorporating all this sort of experience into trying to build an index which captured what the public was experiencing. So a lot of experience day to day has to do with gasoline, fuel oil, food, household expenses, prescription drugs, all these kinds of things. So we were trying to capture that and build an index accordingly. Next slide, please. So we constructed an EPI, Everyday Price Index. We used the BLS survey. They've surveyed all of these people to find out what they actually buy. So we started with that. We've got that raw data. We don't need to resurvey to get that information. We can use the raw data series. They went out and shopped. I don't need to pay somebody to go out and shop. I'd like to go out and shop, but no, I don't have to do that. I can just use their shopping experience to get the prices. We set up dynamic weights to adjust annually to price responses. When prices go up on something, you tend to buy something else. I was at one shopping mall before they were bought out and they had both a cookie factory and a Mrs. Fields cookies in the mall. Now, I'm a particular fan of Mrs. Fields, and I would go to Mrs. Fields and I'd check out the prices. I'm an economist too. And if the prices had gone up at Mrs. Fields, I'd go to the cookie factory. All right? That's what you do, right? You know, and if they were the other way, I'd go the other way. So, you know, you do that. You make adjustments according to prices. And so the shopping list needs to change. And so we have got some mathematics that allows us to dynamically shift the prices according to the expenditure levels with the prices. So we try to incorporate all of that. We also, it turns out that the everyday expenditure is about 39% of the total expenditure. We went through and selected purchases that were everyday experiences, things that you might typically buy every day or two, at least once or twice a month. And we do not seasonally adjust because, again, we want to see what you experience, what price you experience today. Okay, next slide. So our selection was that we looked at products or services that a typical consumer might purchase within the length of a month, typically, you know, once or twice a month or more often. The most prominent kinds of things are food and beverages, whether in a grocery store or in a restaurant or whatever. Household expenses, which includes everything, including your utilities and the products you use to clean house and to maintain house and all those sorts of things. Motor fuel and transportation costs, buses and other commuting and so on, recreation costs, prescription drugs, all those kind of things that you are likely to be paying out day to day. We exclude durable goods. Durable to me is something like a refrigerator. They last a long time. Okay, housing and frequent purchases. So it excludes refrigerators, televisions, housing, even something like a men's suit. We had debates about these things, you know, and we looked at the numbers to see how often people buy them, and we would come up with a sense of whether it qualified. It also eliminates most of the quality adjustments that I talked about, like with my Ford Mustang or my earlier Ford, because of the things we picked. They don't happen to be things that have quality adjustments. So we eliminated most of that problem at the same time. Next. Well, what we found was that we can actually validate the public's experience. Big surprise. You're right. You experience what you experience, no matter what anybody says. We found out that your everyday price experience is much higher than was reported by the CPI. If we look at the average annual inflation rate for 2011, according to the CPI, it was 3.1%. According to our EPI, it was 8%. Quite a bit more. Quite a bit more. These are the prices you actually experience. More recently, the EPI accelerated to 1.9% in March. That's 1.9% for 1 month. 1 month. Which, if you multiply that by 12, that's roughly 22.8% on an annualized basis. So that's why when you go to the grocery store, to the gas pump, you are feeling like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And then you keep hearing on the news, oh, inflation is under control. There's not a problem. This is the difference. This is the inflation risk that you experience. Okay, this is the problem, is that if you know about long-term inflation and you make preparations for that, you're going to be surprised when you find that the inflation rate is much higher. The CPI increased by only 0.8% over the same time. So again, the everyday prices you experience, much higher experienced inflation rate. Next, please. This shows over recent months, a year and a half or so, EPI versus CPI. The, I don't know, it's green or blue bar. The bigger bars are the EPI. And you can see one of the things that jumps out is that the EPI is much more volatile. It's much more volatile, and the numbers are quite a bit bigger. Now, I'll point out that for the sake of comparison, this CPI, we took out the seasonal adjustments so we could at least see how it compares. So this is even, the CPI here is even higher than the one you normally hear about. So this is to say that the EPI is quite a bit bigger, and you can even see periods in here where there was quite a bit of deflation as the prices swung the other way. So there's a lot of information here that you would not normally have. Okay, next. So one question that comes to mind is first of all, how is this a new phenomenon? Is this something that's been going on for a long time? Is this something I should worry about? Well, the CPI and EPI, it turns out, trended closely together until around the early years of the last decade. So after 2002, the EPI started to outpace the CPI, started to take off, and it became more volatile. And there's a lot of reasons why this probably happened. There are oil and energy costs that rose, rapid technological changes that restrained prices of some products, quality adjustments on all the high technology products that have been introduced, and so on. Globalization. Next, please. Oop. One more. There we go. So you can see that here until about 2002, they were very close. I got to stand down here. And then you can see that they expand. They get much farther apart from that point on. And the swings are much larger in the EPI after that point. And this CPI is not seasonally adjusted. So we've even allowed it to be more realistic than the normal way that it's stated. Okay, next. This shows the inflation rates. And you can see the average inflation rate on the EPI is higher, and the swings are much larger. We look at 12 months. This is the change from 12 months ago. And so you can see that the numbers are much larger for the EPI. And after 2002, after we get up into this point, you can see that it really starts to blow out. There's something going on that's making it worse. In other words, maybe you could get away without taking this into account before 2000, but you shouldn't be able to get away with it anymore. Something has changed. Okay, next. There are other reasons to be concerned about inflation. The Federal Reserve, in an attempt to try to stabilize the economy, to work through the financial crisis, and I am trying to say that there was a real crisis and they were trying to deal with it, and the way the Fed deals with this when they engage in their policy is to expand the money supply, and the way they expand the money supply is by putting money into bank reserves under the assumption that the banks will then make loans. That's the way it works. The Fed doesn't make loans to individuals. Banks make loans to individuals and to businesses. So the Fed puts the money in the banks and hopes the banks will make the loans. If we look at bank reserves, in 2011 alone, adjusted bank reserves increased at a compounded annual rate of 47.1%. Phenomenal. The first half alone was 187%. Huge, massive increase in bank reserves as they try to stimulate the economy and continue to stimulate it. Banks are currently holding about $1.5 trillion in excess of the reserves they're required to hold. It's about 15 times their required reserves. Normally they hold 1 or 2% over their reserves, not 15 times. This is a phenomenal number. But they haven't started making the loans until recently. They're starting to make the loans, which is finally moving the money into the economy where it can affect prices. So as the bank lending returns to these normal levels, we should see the money supply increase by as much as 40%, unless the Fed can somehow stop it and drain off the excesses. And they are aware of this, they talk about it, they would like to do it. Next. This shows a graph of the required reserves and below, and the little blue line is what they were actually holding. And as you can see, they're basically the same. They're 1 or 2% over what they were required to hold all over these years until the recent financial crisis. And look at that. 15 times required reserves. Massive amounts of reserves that they piled into the banks, and they're just sitting there until the banks make the loans. And when they make the loans, it becomes money supply, and it starts affecting prices and inflation. This is what we're worried about. This is what we're worried about. Next. We looked at that estimate of 40% increase in the money supply. We compared it with 103 countries over 10 years around the world, 103 countries around the world. This is the scatter plot, and that line is the regression line that fits. You look at a 40% increase in the money supply, and it's consistent with the 15% inflation rate. That's a CPI rate. The current CPI rate's around 3. The EPI rate is going to be off the chart. See, this is the concern. Next. So what do you do? How do you solve this problem? We're talking about a risk. And I don't want to come off like I'm saying the sky is falling, because, you know, it could work out, and I hope it does. I live here too. You know, I worry a lot about that. I want the Fed to be able to drain off those excess reserves, and I don't want the inflation rate to be through the roof. But I'm just showing you, if I take the trajectory, where things are going, and I simply go forward with it, we're looking at very high inflation rates, and your everyday experience with inflation is going to be very high. It'll be much, much higher than the CPI. And so we need to start thinking about how we conduct our everyday affairs to deal with the potential of an inflationary environment, and equally important, what do we do with our finances and our investments? How do we deal with this kind of environment? And that's where John Barry comes in. John?